So this is my short keynote lecture on exploration, the last topic in Unit 1 that we look at. Okay, uh, let's start by looking at what we call the spice trade in Europe from about the 1100s up until the 15th century. When we talk about the spice trade, uh, I want to remind you that spices, as they arrived in Europe, did not come in little glass bottles and neat little packages like we see in the supermarket today. So, the first thing we need to do is eliminate that image of spices that we get. Don't think of spices like we see them in our kitchens today. When spices arrived in Europe, back in the 15th century, they arrived in huge crates. They arrived in incredibly big bundles, heavy burdens, because these spices were essentially seeds from trees. Or in some cases, the bark from the trees. And so, my point is this: when you think of a spice market in 15th century Europe, you have to imagine a vast marketplace filled with crates and trays and boxes of unprocessed spices. For instance, if you look at this slide, you'll see some of the raw form of these spices. So we have at the top left ginger root. And to the right of that is a photograph of a pepper tree, which they happen to grow all over California. And then going down, we have nutmeg, cinnamon in the middle there in the lower level, and then finally cloves. Now, all five of these were incredibly popular in Europe, especially nutmeg. Nutmeg was used medicinally, and I want to point that out too, that spices in the 15th century were for much more than cooking. We're not talking culinary usage. These were medicinal as well. So you must keep that in mind, that the medicinal value alone of these spices was incredible. Okay, so just use your imagination and just look at these pictures and realize that, okay, uh, take something like pepper, which was very popular. Pepper was used by an incredible amount, even as early as the 1100s. Okay, so take something like pepper. All right, in order to meet the demands for pepper in Europe, and I want you to just do the math in your head. In order to meet the demands for pepper or nutmeg or cloves or any of these spices, I just want you to imagine how much had to make its way back to Europe. Just imagine that. To meet the demand that people had for pepper or nutmeg or cloves or cinnamon, just imagine how much had to be shipped back. Okay, and I think by being considerate, by just considering that, I think it helps to understand this movement toward Atlantic trade with Christopher Columbus. Um, Overland trade routes for the spice trade took up to 6 months, and that's being I'm being conservative. I could probably say 8 months or 9 months. Okay, the spice trade overland was extremely dangerous, and the merchants and the traders faced many dangers. First of all, of course, they had to cross treacherous mountain terrain. Okay, if you look at the map, they're passing through several mountain ranges in primarily the uh, Himalayan range as they head through northern India. Okay. And then into China. Okay, so they're traveling. So on the one hand, they have physical features, deserts, mountain ranges, and so forth. Okay, but they also have bandits, and so oftentimes the traders had to pay middlemen, guys who would guarantee their safety, so to speak, for a fee. And so European merchants found themselves basically being taken advantage of by Arab tribal custom, which was to protect people traveling through, but only at a cost. Okay. A third thing that I want you to consider is this: a pack animal like a horse or a donkey or a camel can only carry so much. And so I want you to remember on the previous slide when I asked you to just do the math in your head and try to imagine how much of this stuff, those spices, had to meet the demands in Europe. Okay? And if you think about that, you realize that that's a lot of cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and so forth that's being shipped back into Europe. And pack animals can only carry so much. Plus, keep in mind, pack animals are expensive to upkeep. Okay? They require food and water, shelter, and so forth. Okay. All right, which brings us now to the exploration. The country that leads in exploration is, without a doubt, Portugal. You might be thinking of Italy, but remember, the Italian city-states of the Renaissance, like Florence, Genoa, and so forth, they did all of their trade in the Mediterranean. What makes Portugal important is that Portugal begins to look to the Atlantic. Under the direction and patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, who promoted ocean exploration, shipbuilding techniques, especially in cargo, and finally navigation techniques. Okay, if you look at the map, you'll see that one of the first Portuguese explorers to take to the Atlantic was Bartholomew Diaz. And he sailed to the southern tip of continental Africa, mapping the coastal portion of continental Africa, reaching the southern tip, and then returning to Portugal, thereby demonstrating that it was possible. Our next Portuguese navigator was Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama followed more or less the route of Bartholomew Diaz, insofar as the southern tip of continental Africa. But then he continues along the eastern coast of continental Africa, mapping the coastal land, and then reaching India. Portugal, as a result of Vasco da Gama's journeys, Portugal takes over the spice trade in the Indian Ocean, which had previously been controlled by Arab traders and merchants. Finally, we come to Chris Columbus, okay? Contrary to popular belief, Columbus did not prove the world was round. That had been known for up to 3-4 centuries, okay? So Columbus did not prove that the world was round. Columbus was Italian, but he sailed for Spain. He sailed under the patronage of Isabella and Ferdinand. Okay. And in his quest to reach what he believed China, he proposed sailing west. He landed in the Caribbean islands, convinced that he had reached Asia, the islands of the islands off of China, and he was convinced that China was just beyond the horizon. All he had to do was sail a little bit further and he'd reach China. Now, note that Columbus made several voyages. According to the map, you'll see that there was the first voyage and so forth. He established, though, what came to be called the Columbian Exchange. This was basically an exchange, of course, being back and forth. So gold and products from the New World were being shipped to Europe. And because of the European contact with the natives, you had diseases and you had, of course, violent oppression on the part of the Spaniards, the conquistadores, into the New World native populations. So this is my overview of exploration. I hope it helps in your reviewing of Palmer material in Chapter 2.